Anti-human.
Interesting. Plants and humans are more similar than you think. Blog. Plants and humans are more similar than you think. April 4th, 2018. You probably wouldn't conclude that plants and humans are related just from looking at them. After all, we're not green, and we can't use light to produce sugars. But if you look beyond the leaf and go deep into a plant's genome, you'll see some striking similarities. Believe it or not, plants and animals share many of the same genes, but we use some of them in different ways. For a good example of this, you need only look to the eyes absent, EYA genes. These genes help flies build eyes, aid in human development, and contribute to plant embryogenesis. Like many genes, EYA was first described in fruit flies. Geneticists found that loss of the gene caused flies to develop without any eyes, hence the eyes absent name. Since that time, there have been numerous versions of EYA described. Humans have 4 different versions. Flies have just one, and plants have their own distinct version as well. Though the DNA coding for each of these versions is different, they're similar enough that they've been collectively labeled as the EYA genes 1. Gene families. If the DNA sequence differs between species, why do we call them all EYA genes? The answer has to do more with their similarities than their differences. The DNA sequence is similar enough that scientists can trace them all back to a single ancient gene. Because each of these genes are derived from a single ancestor, they're all considered members of the same family. Point 12. The EYA genes produce proteins by the same name, a common convention in biology. Typically, when we think of proteins, we think of them as serving one function, like how a hammer is used to hammer nails, but not to tighten bolts. EYA proteins are not like this. Instead, they're like the Swiss Army knife of proteins, because they're capable of doing some dramatically different processes within a cell. Their most well-known activity is to help regulate gene expression, the reading of a gene. In fact, EYA proteins help direct the formation of eyes in flies by regulating when and where important eye-forming genes are used. This is why variants in the DNA that prevent formation of EYA proteins results in loss of a fly's eyes. Because of their ability to regulate gene expression, EYA proteins are considered transcriptional cofactors, similar to transcription factors. The co points to the fact that the EYA proteins have to get help from other proteins in order to regulate gene expression. 1. The function of EYA genes in regulating gene expression appears to be a relatively new ability. In plants, EYA is missing an important part of the protein, which prevents it from acting as a transcriptional cofactor. Instead, its main function is to regulate the action of other proteins. 1. To understand this concept, it helps to view proteins as small robots whose activity is controlled by an on-off switch. By flipping that switch, cells can control when a protein is functioning and when it's not. In reality, it's far more complex than this, because there are many different kinds of switches and dials that control a protein's function, and some proteins don't have a switch at all. By altering these switches and dials, cells can control the processes that are happening inside them. Specialized proteins are built by a cell whose sole purpose is to regulate the function of other proteins. It appears that EYA proteins may have first evolved to serve this purpose. By comparing and contrasting the EYA genes in different organisms, scientists believe that an ancient ancestor of both plants and animals first developed EYA genes to help it regulate other proteins. Over time, as plants and animals evolved separately, EYA proteins gained the added ability to regulate genes as well. 1. An ancient ancestor of both plants and animals first developed EYA genes. So, what about in humans? Research has shown us that EYA proteins in humans are able to regulate both genes and other proteins. Studies in mice suggest that EYA genes influence development of the lungs, kidneys, and brain, and have an active role to play in DNA damage repair. People with variants in the EYA1 gene, one of the human versions of EYA, offer evidence that EYA proteins may also influence development of our ear and auditory senses. These variants are believed to underlie branchiotorenal syndrome, a developmental disease which affects about 1 in every 40,000 people. These variants affect development of the ears, neck, and kidneys. Curiously, despite the gene's name, YOOOO genes actually seem to not have a critical role in mammalian eye development. 1. Plants are different from humans in many ways, but perhaps not as many as you think. At the DNA level, genes can give us clues about how related we are to other organisms, even flies and plants. So the next time you look at a blade of grass, remember that you're looking at a distant relative. 1. Tajuj, Emmanuel, and Rashmi S. Hegde. The eye's absent proteins in development in disease. Cellular and Molecular Life Sciences. CMLS 70.11, 2013. Are humans like plants? Yep, similar in some ways. We humans sometimes forget we have deep roots. Even though we perceive that we might be wilting or getting weaker, our roots are strong, and we are able to rejuvenate and keep growing, persevering. I think our roots are kind of like our consciousness and our energy. We are capable of regermination, regrowth, and a bit of sunlight and rain will strengthen us. I have a few rose bushes. They were so tiny when I planted them. Some years they almost look like they're not going to make it. I prune off the parts that seem to be dying, and sure enough, the following year they grow bigger, and the roses seem to bloom brighter and appear more intense in color. I also talk to my plants and sprinkle some fresh topsoil and plant food on the ground around the bottom of the rose bushes. Have a gorgeous rhododendron also, and I have an old sycamore tree which is pretty big. It sheds and drops leaves year-round. I don't really pay much attention to it. Little shoots keep sprouting on the trunk dot, and many birds have built nests in the high branches over the past 13 years. Yeah, I believe we're all a part of nature, and we're more resilient than we think we are. It's just my opinion. My rhododendron bush, and what used to be my teensy little rose plant I planted. Rose plant was about 4 inches high when I bought it on sale at Kmart 13 years ago. How many genes do I share with a flower? Here's the thing, this was a challenging question for me to answer. The reason for this has nothing to do with my ability, or possibly lack thereof, you be the judge, to provide a scientific answer. It's a difficult question for me to answer, because subjecting people to horrible puns is admittedly a guilty pleasure of mine. So, just imagine all the self-discipline it took for me to title this post something other than shake, shake what you got in them jeans. Rapping Master P lyrics may be another guilty pleasure of mine. If you can still take me seriously as a human, let alone a scientist, I encourage you to stay with me and read this whole post, because I actually love this question. I am fascinated by genetics and I love flowers, so it's not surprising that using genetics to compare myself to a flower is how I have chosen to spend my Saturday. The answer to this question varies depending on the exact flower, but I am going to not so randomly choose to focus on how similar we are to a daffodil, so we can put this number into context. 30% of the genes found in a daffodil can be found within humans. I am going to give you a minute to let that sink in. That sounds crazy to you too, right? I mean, humans can do all sorts of things that flowers simply cannot. Things like thinking, talking, moving, eating cheeseburgers, and on that note, grilling cheeseburgers. Need a more technical example of how different we are. Plants require carbon dioxide to generate energy from sunlight. This is a process called photosynthesis, which produces oxygen as a byproduct. You, on the other hand, require oxygen to generate the energy that drives just about every cellular process in your body. This process is called respiration and produces carbon dioxide as a byproduct. So, there's an example of how plants and humans are designed in completely contrasting manners. Yet, we are 30% similar at the genetic level. Technically speaking, plants also utilize respiration, although their version doesn't require oxygen. It sounds crazy, but it actually can all be explained pretty simply, not to mention raise an interesting conversation about commensal interactions. But, before we dive into the nitty-gritty details that will help us understand in what ways we are actually similar to plants, want to know how similar we are to a bunch of other random, living things. I am about to do a bit of a fact drop, so hold onto your jeans. Couldn't resist, at least it's not in the title. At the genetic level, humans are about 25 to 35% similar to plants' flowers generally, 44% similar to a honeybee, 65% similar to a chicken, 60% similar to a banana, 61% similar to a housefly, 80% similar to a cow, 88% similar to a mouse, 90% similar to a cat, 98% similar to a chimpanzee. This video. Okay, so now that we have seen how similar we are to some other organisms, maybe being 30% genetically similar to a daffodil isn't all that crazy. So let's get back to the daffodil. What does the 30% that we have in common with this cute little flower even mean? A lot, actually. And in fact, there are some pretty important similarities between plants and humans. We absorb food similarly. Both humans and plants promote environments that support the growth of microbes that can generate nutrients essential to our respective metabolisms. In humans, this environment is the intestine, and the essential nutrients that are produced are mainly vitamins, while plants rely on microbes in the soil surrounding their roots to supply them with nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Cool. So that similarity could account for some of our genetic similarity to plants. But I am sure you want an example you actually care about, or should. Let's look at a well-studied and medically relevant example of how plants and humans are similar. Get Katie McCallum's stories in your inbox. Join Medium for free to get updates from this writer. Subscribe. Remember me for faster sign-in. Like humans, plants have highly developed immune systems that are required to fight off infection. Plants also use a lot of the same types of molecules as humans to detect an invading microbe. For instance, both humans and plants use a pretty simple, evolutionarily conserved mechanism of relying on their ability to distinguish self from non-self. This is called the innate immune system. Because of the similarity, scientists actually study the plant innate immune system in labs as a simpler way to better understand our innate immune systems. These discoveries made in plants are often relevant to humans. If you're still reading, you may be wondering all of the following: why choose to compare ourselves to a flower by looking at genetic similarity? What are genes and what is a genome? What are genes and why are they so important? First, let's talk about genes and why it's important to understand why they are important. Are you getting that this is important yet? Genes are sequences of DNA that provide instructions for building these incredibly powerful biological tools called proteins. Proteins carry out functions of our body, like breathing. Important. Without a specific gene, your body can't make a specific protein, and therefore cannot perform that specific function. So, if my genome lacks the gene that is the blueprint for lactase, a protein that is required to break down lactose into glucose and galactose, aka simple sugars, I am probably a person who is lactose intolerant and should really try to avoid milk products unless I enjoy being uncomfortable. Again, important. We make a ton of proteins and, because of this, we need a ton of genes as instructions. Our collection of these tons of genes is called our genome. Okay, so now that we understand why genes are so important, I think it's a little easier to understand why we would consider using them to compare ourselves to other organisms. It's important to keep in mind that there are obviously a lot of ways to classify beings, but we have been subscribing to phylogenetics, which is the study of relationships among groups of organisms by comparing traits we inherit from our predecessors. Since Aristotle was wandering the earth saying things like, "No excellent soul is exempt from a mixture of madness," basically a long time. What is phylogenetics? The practice of using phylogenetics to compare organisms has evolved over time, just like the genes it studies. In its infancy, phylogenetics was mainly used to categorize organisms based on observable traits, including shape, size, and color. Today, a powerful approach called comparative genomics, which largely depends on computer-based analysis, compares species at the level of the genes that make up their individual genomes. As I mentioned before, genomes are chock full of genes, each with their own biological purpose. So it's no surprise that comparisons at this level can provide massive amounts of information regarding biological similarities and differences. With technology that allows us to identify the sequence of every single gene in an organism, we can now use comparative genomics to ask questions like the one posed. Since both the human and daffodil genomes have been sequenced, we can distinguish the shared genes, or those that are present in both genomes, from those that are specific to each organism. So, where does that leave us? Ultimately, this is how we can conclude that, at the genetic level, humans are 30% similar to daffodils, as 30% of our genes can also be found in the daffodil genome. From here, scientists can ask a multitude of questions, particularly those with evolutionary and biological implications. I, personally, am thrilled to share 30% of my genetic identity with a flower, because, well, it's better than sharing 30% of my genes with a cockroach. Excuse me while I research how similar we are to cockroaches. Sources: Marx, J. What it means to be 98% chimpanzee, apes, people, and their genes. 2002, University of California Press. Zimmer, C. Genes Are Us and Them, National Geographic. 2013, Pontius, J.U. et al. Initial Sequence and Comparative Analysis of the Cat Genome. Genome Research. 2007, Elsick, C.G. et al. The Genome Sequence of Taurine Cattle. A Window to Ruminant Biology and Evolution. Science. 2009, Marks, J. et al. 98% chimpanzee and 35% daffodil. Genetic Nature Culture, Anthropology, and Science, Beyond the Two-Culture Divide. University of California Press. 2003. The Special Relationship Between People and Trees. People and trees have far more things in common than many of us realize. Below we share some interesting and wonderful things people and trees have in common, and why the relationship between people and trees is so special and important. This includes the fact that both humans and trees are mostly water. We share similar physical characteristics, and each one of us are completely unique. In addition, humans and trees are interdependent. We breathe in oxygen and breathe out carbon dioxide, while trees take in carbon dioxide and release oxygen. This extraordinary connection between people and trees is evolving even further as more and more people are electing to use a tree urn after they pass. With this, families can grow a beautiful living memorial tree from a living urn containing cremated ashes to honor a loved one and give back. What people and trees have in common. There are many similarities between people and trees. Below we've highlighted a few of them. Physical characteristics. Both people and trees stand upright with a crown on top and limbs stemming from a central trunk. In addition, the tubular branching pattern of our lungs resembles the root system of many trees. Uniqueness and beauty. Every person and every tree is unique and no two are exactly alike. With trees, colors can vary, branches can grow and bend at different angles, and buds and flowers occur at different places. Similar to people, trees have different growth rates, with variation in height and volume. Some grow tall while others are short. Some remain skinny and others grow wide. The uniqueness and diversity evident in both trees and people helps to make the world a more interesting and beautiful place. Reliance on water. Both people and trees are comprised of mostly water and rely on this resource to survive. Most trees are made up of more than 50% water. Similarly, an adult person is made up of approximately 60% water. Without water, life as we know it would not be possible for people, trees, and everything else. Reliance on others. Did you know that there are just as many microbes on the human body as actual human cells? Even though these microbes are not part of the body, they perform functions important to human life. Similar to people, trees also rely on other living organisms for survival and reproduction. For example, many trees rely on certain fungi to stick to their roots and to enable them to sufficiently extract water from the soil. In addition, many trees and shrubs, including the cherry tree, serviceberry, plum, among others, rely on pollinating insects to exchange pollen from their flowering blooms to regenerate. Live in communities. According to an article in the Smithsonian in March 2018, researchers have compiled evidence that trees of the same species are actually communal organisms, like humans, and can even form alliances with trees of other species. The researchers also found that forest trees have evolved to live in interdependent and cooperative relationships that are sustained by communication and a collective intelligence similar to an insect colony or a city. The symbiotic relationship between people and trees. Trees and people have an interdependent relationship. One example is we breathe in oxygen and breathe out carbon dioxide. Trees, on the other hand, take in carbon dioxide and release oxygen into the atmosphere. The role trees play in the ecosystem is vital for human and other life on Earth. In addition, trees support us by providing shade and shelter, preventing soil erosion, serving as windbreaks, cleaning the groundwater, and by providing food. Trees and spirituality. The special connection between people and trees can be seen in cultures all over the world, even going back to ancient times. As we admire trees today and understand the importance of their role for life on Earth, so did early man. This is evident in the symbolism of trees recorded throughout history. In addition to providing needs such as food, shelter, healing, and protection, trees have also played an important part in the spirituality of various groups of people and religions. The tree of life, or trees used as a symbol, can be found throughout various religious texts. This includes the tree of knowledge and tree of life in the Bible, the tree of immortality in the Quran, the Assyrian tree of life in ancient Mesopotamia, and the bo or Bodhi tree in Buddhism, among others. In addition, ancient people in Greece, Persia, and other regions commonly use the world tree motif symbol, which shows the roots of the tree wrapped around earth and its branches in the heavens. This symbol represents a tree which supports the heavens and connecting the heavens to the terrestrial world, and with its roots, the underworld. Trees and a sense of place. Trees connect us to where we live. Our eyes are often drawn to them when we go outdoors, and they can serve as landmarks and help us find our way. Many people consciously or subconsciously remember a place they visited by what trees were present and can have a feeling or memory come to mind when they see a tree. For example, people who are from or lived in coastal areas of California, Florida, or Hawaii can remember memorable times in their life, and at those moments palm trees being present. If you're from Ohio or Pennsylvania, many will remember a childhood filled with maple trees and the beautiful fall colors they displayed. Other people can remember the scent of orange or cherry blossoms from a nearby grove growing up, or the majestic pine and spruce trees from vacations in the mountains. The future, mankind, and trees. According to a recent study by Yale University, there are over 3 trillion trees on Earth. However, these numbers are declining by over 15 billion per year, and we've lost over 45% of the trees on Earth since mankind began cutting them down. On the other hand, there are over 7.6 billion people on Earth, and this number is growing at approximately 80 million per year. The good news is many people are aware of this issue and are working hard to preserve and protect ecosystems and trees for future generations. Organizations like the Arbor Day Foundation and others are focused on replanting our precious forests that have suffered from fires, insect infestation, and human destruction. In addition, the concept of the living urn is growing in popularity and contributes to these preservation efforts in a truly personal way. The idea of a tree burial connects with so many people because of the special relationship that exists between people and trees. What better way to honor a loved one and give back to the ones left behind than to plant a living urn, buy a tree urn, and create a tree memorial? In addition, for every living urn planted, the company donates to plant a second tree in an area in the U.S. in need of reforestation, doubling the impact. Filed in, tree burial, tree urn, trees and people. Previous article. Miniature urns versus full-size urns, when each makes sense. In recent years, there has been an explosion of scientific and popular interest in the question of plant intelligence. While many scientists are hesitant to extend terms previously reserved for humans and an increasing number of animals to plants, research continuously reveals that plants are remarkably complex responders to information about their environments. Predators, kin, beneficial partnerships with other plants, animals, and insects, as well as their own bodies and growth. Plants appear to be able to remember, learn, make choices, communicate, and have complex social lives. Plants also move, although usually too slowly, and occasionally too quickly, for us to notice. Calvo 2022-95. Do these abilities suggest that plants are intelligent? Does it mean that they are conscious, aware of themselves and what's around them? Do they model their worlds and make plans? Do they have intentions? Do they feel and avoid pain or seek pleasure? What would it be like, if anything, to be a plant? Does one need a brain to experience and act in the world? Contemporary science can't answer these questions, but it also has little to say about our own consciousness, where it comes from or precisely how it relates to our brains, bodies, and social and physical environments. Part of why research into plant intelligence is so controversial is that it is difficult to understand the complexity of plant behavior without anthropomorphizing, without projecting our own inner lives onto plants. In her recent book, The Light Eaters, science journalist Zoe Schlanger relates how even scientists who are careful not to attribute human qualities, like agency, to plants in their scientific papers, speak freely about plants in casual conversation as if they were aware, make choices, have preferences, and so on. She also notes that it was not that long ago when Western intellectual elites considered non-human animals to be mere automatons incapable of feeling fear or pain during vivisection, and wonders what it would be like to bring plants into our circle of ethical concern, as many of us have done with, at least some animals. In this disorienting era of ecological crisis fueled by modern industry and lifeways, many of us are reevaluating our relationship to the more than human world. We are seeking knowledge from scientific research, as well as from spiritual traditions as we reconsider our ethical responsibilities to other forms of life on the planet as well as to future generations of human beings. Popular interest in plant intelligence runs parallel to and often intersects with a growing respect for indigenous, often animist, ways of relating to the more than human world, as well as for the healing powers of plant medicines and plant spirits or teachers. These themes converge in a number of recent books, such as Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass, 2015, Jeremy Narby and Raphael Chantry Pizzeri's Plant Teachers, 2021, and evolutionary ecologist Monica Gagliano's fascinating memoir, Thus Spoke the Plant, 2018, in which she recounts how her scientific research into plant learning and memory was inspired and, at times, directed by plant spirits, whom she met through dreams, Dita, and fasting supported by Shipibo and Aboriginal plant doctors. Interest in these themes have also led earth-conscious Buddhists to wonder how plants figure in traditional Buddhist doctrine and what role they might play in our spiritual practice. To help support this inquiry, this essay provides an overview of Indian Buddhist views on the sentience of plants and later East Asian views on their Buddha nature, and concludes with a few idiosyncratic reflections on what this all means for practice. Are plants sentient? In early Buddhism, there are 4 comprehensive terms for living beings, which function as quasi-synonyms: pran and pain, animate, possessing breath or energy, pranapana, sattva satta, sentient, jiva, living being, and buddha, being. All of these imply sentience, or the possession of mind-heart, chitta, and capacity to feel pleasure and pain. In some of the oldest Buddhist texts, we find plants listed among the category of living and sentient beings. For example, in the Sutta Nipata, a Vasiha Sutta list of animate beings begins with grasses and Trishiruka, Schmidthausen 2009, 23. And the Karanaya Metta Sutta advises those who aspire to be skilled in metta to wish for the safety and happiness of all beings. Whatever living beings, pa with macron a, there may be, mobile, tassa, or stationary, thavara, omitting none. Those who are long or great, middling, short or small. Most English translations render tassa and thavara as weak or frail and strong or firm, respectively, but their literal meaning is closer to mobile and stationary. The Sutta Nipata commentary explains that thavara should be taken metaphorically as spiritual and emotional stability, in contrast to tassa, which it connects via homonym to craving, trs, and trembling with fear, tras. In other words, thavara beings are arhats and tassa, the rest of us. This somewhat contrived explanation coheres with the later settled Buddhist view that plants are not sentient. However, the pre-Buddhist meaning of the phrase is well attested with mobile edessa, referring to animals, and stationar thavara, referring to plants, Schmidthausen 1991, 2009. This was meant to be inclusive of all living beings, much like the English phrase, fauna and flora. This phrase is found in older Buddhist verse, but also in a few suttas, typically in connection with the instruction not to injure or oppress beings, but to protect them and suffuse them with metta, Schmidthausen 1991, 60. The idea that plants were not only alive but to some degree sentient was commonplace in ancient India. It is found in Vedic and Hindu thought and is a central tenet of Jainism. According to Lambert Schmidthausen, who has done the most in-depth research on the topic, early Buddhists neither confirmed nor denied plant sentience, but instead treated plants as a borderline case, as somewhere on the boundary between sentient and insentient. 1991, 2009. They either didn't feel the need to decide the matter, or found it pragmatically useful to avoid doing so. Thus, we find early Buddhists using the older Indian nomenclature that included plants as sentient beings, and making prohibitions against injury to plants for monastics and occasionally for lay followers. But nothing like the Jain view that killing plants violates the precept against taking life. Schmidthausen speculates that from a practical perspective, it would have been unseemly for Buddhist monastics to violate rules commonly followed by other ascetics. But it would also have been impractical for lay Buddhists to refrain from farming or carving up fruits and vegetables. This is supported by a commentarial explanation of the monastic prohibition against injury to plants that explains that some people, not necessarily Buddhist, believe plants are sentient. Schmidthausen 1991, 1627. Other commentarial explanations include the ideas that trees and other plants are the fields where they grow may be the abode for small living beings, or that trees may be the home for spirits or deities, a view still found in South Asia today. There are also a few places where injury or harm to a tree that has provided one with shade or fruit is admonished as disloyalty or ingratitude. Schmidthausen 1991, 74. It is only later that South Asian Buddhist traditions, both Theravada and Mahayana, affirmed the view that plants are neither sentient nor living. Again, these concepts were regarded coextensive. Schmithausen suggests that this coincides with a general push towards the rationalization of Buddhist thought, as it appears to be guided by conceptual clarity and rational consistency, rather than by empirical observation. 1991-95. A clearer theoretical distinction between the sentient and insentient also helped support the vegetarianism proposed in some Mahayana texts beginning in the 5th century, Schmithausen 2005. Though the sentience of plants was not a primary topic of inquiry, it came up during debates on topics such as karma. Whereas the Jains regarded plants' positive and negative responses to stimulation and their growth and movements towards sun, water, and nutrients as signs of feeling pleasure and pain, and indicative of some form of consciousness and perception related to the sense faculty of touch, Mahayana polemicists insisted that these were merely automatic processes. They compared plants' movements to iron filings moving under the force of a magnet, and then cited lack of autonomous movement as a sign of plants' insentience. 1. For when an interlocutor countered with the example of the mimosa plant, which has the habit of curling up when touched, the Buddhist replied that this is simply like the curling of a hair when exposed to a flame. Schmithausen 1991-88. The mimosa was not only a favorite for ancient plant observers, but for modern researchers as well, owing to the fact that we can see its curling movement in real time, without any need for the time-lapse photography that helps bring plants alive for us in nature documentaries. 2. It is also one of the plants Gagliano used to study plant learning and memory. Because mimosas also curl up when they are dropped, she dropped mimosas a bunch of times, without hurting them, to see if they could remember the experience and learn to relax, given that there was no real danger. They did. 3. If experiments like this cause us to doubt whether plants are truly insentient, incapable of feeling pain, and completely devoid of any mind, even one radically different from our own, Buddhists who choose not to eat meat for ethical reasons, or as part of their understanding of the first precept, may still, like the Indian Mahayanists, want to draw a distinction between plants and animals. This has to do with the ethical implications of plant sentience for us human beings. But how about for plants themselves? Are plants subject to karma and rebirth? Ancient Indian theories of rebirth sometimes involve journeys through various elemental, vegetal, and animal realms, and at the time of the Buddha, Jains and some Hindus considered plants subject to the cycle of rebirth. However, Buddhists adopted what Schmithausen 1991-96 calls the human zigzag model of rebirth, with a sojourn in another world before returning to human form. From this human-centric perspective, other realms of existence, even the animal realm, are essentially pre- and post-human births, and there is no place in this cycle for plants or for fungi. Though Buddhist teachings and practices may help us relate more wholesomely to other forms of life, classical Indian Buddhist doctrine is aimed squarely at the problem of human suffering, and offers little insight into other forms of life except as reflections of the positive potential and negative consequences of human action. In addition to being able to feel pleasure and pain, life as a sentient being, sattva, entails having a mind, chitta, and intentions, satana. In a pre-Buddhist usage, the term satana, intention, or intending, meant basic sentience. This meaning is reflected in the Buddhist suttas when they explain that without satana, a body is dead like a block of wood, or becomes food for other beings. Myers 2023. Classical Buddhist doctrine builds on this meaning when it defines karma in terms of satana, as in the Uttara Nikaya 6.63, when the Buddha says, I say, O monks, intention, satana, is karma. Intending, one acts with the body, speech, or mind. According to the classical Buddhist view, if plants are sentient, they would be, like us, subject to karma, suffering, and rebirth, unless they choose to take up the path and become liberated. Though I am personally inclined to think of some, or maybe all plants as in some way sentient and as free of the kinds of suffering we humans experience, I must confess that it seems odd, and more than a little anthropocentric, to think of plants as subject to karma and rebirth, or to place them on a hierarchy of beings according to the quality of their karma. Would birth as a plant be lower or higher than a human birth? How would plants compare to the insects and the other animals they often outwit? Ellison Banks Finley, Plant Lives. Borderline Beings in Indian Traditions, 2008, has proposed that plants' borderline status in early Buddhism, including their inability to accumulate karma for, and their stability, i.e., the fact they are stationary, thavara beings, suggests that they were regarded as saintly beings akin to arhats. though the textual evidence doesn't appear to support this view. 5. We do find Jatakas, tales of the Buddha's previous lives, in which the Bodhisattva is born as a tree spirit, and even as a spirit inhabiting Kusha grass, Kusane Jataka. In one story, a tree spirit also refers to the tree as her body Bodhisattva Jataka. But the more common view is that trees can be homes for spirits, such that the spirit can move to another tree, or survive the felling of their tree, and complain to the Buddha about the loss of their home. Schmithaz in 1991, 1516, 28 FN 149. Some texts also draw similes between the behavior of arhats and that of trees, such as in the Milindapanha when the Buddhist monk Nagasena compares the mind of the arhat to the unshakable trunk of a mighty tree, which remains still even when the tree's branches and leaves are agitated by the wind, or when he compares the tree's impartial offer of shade to all kinds of human persons, to the virtue of equanimity. Becca. 6. While these similes, and others that commend the arhat-like qualities of various animals and natural phenomena can inspire our practice, they do not suggest that South Asian Buddhists consider trees and other plants as sentient, much less saintly beings. With their borderline status, they regarded plants as, at best, barely sentient with only one sense faculty, that of touch. 7. Like arhats, plants do not accumulate karma, but they also lack minds, something that, in an interesting twist of fate, came to be seen as a virtue in some strains of East Asian Buddhism. The Buddha nature of the insentient. From the 6th through 9th centuries, Chinese Buddhists debated whether insentient beings might possess the quality of Buddhahood or Buddha nature. Eventually, the idea that Buddha nature is present in, or as, everything, including plants and trees as well as stones, tiles, human artifacts, and even particles of dust, became widespread in China. The Chinese may have been particularly open to the idea in part because they had no concept of sentient versus insentient beings prior to the arrival of Indian Buddhism. Suki 2018. The Taoist idea of a single principle, or way, Tao pervading the human and natural world, and various indigenous animist ideas may also have contributed to their openness. However, according to Robert Scharf, the debate in China was also fueled by scholastic interests in the formal arts of textual interpretation, or hermeneutics, and Chen Gongan, Koan, Dialectics, Scharf 2007. The seeds of the debate were sown in the 5th century, with the question of whether all sentient beings have Buddha nature in the sense of the capacity to attain awakening. According to an early recension of the Nirva Sutra, sentient beings without faith, Icanticus, cannot awaken, but the monk Daoxing, 360-434, objected, and by the 5th century a version of the sutra stating that all sentient beings have Buddha nature had appeared. By the 6th century, this view was widely accepted, and Chinese thinkers began contemplating an even more universal notion of Buddha nature, a Buddha nature that pervades the entire phenomenal world. Since the sense of Buddha nature would seem to extend to insentient as well as sentient beings, they needed to reconcile it with the Nirva Sutra claim that only sentient beings have Buddha nature, and develop different strategies for doing so. For example, YOOOO 523-592 distinguished between Buddha nature that knows, the mind in sentient beings, and the Dharma realm, or emptiness, which is known and pervades everywhere. The latter presumably includes the insentient, though YOOOO did not say this directly. Jizing, 549-623, went further, claiming, from a Madhyamaka perspective, that while there is no ultimate attainment, or non-attainment, or ultimate difference between sentient and insentient beings, at a provisional level, one can say that grasses and trees have no minds, thus, they have no delusion, and so cannot awaken. Scharf 2007, 212. The Shiante teacher's Hanren, 711-782, is usually credited as the first Chinese thinker to positively affirm the Buddha nature of insentient things. He draws on the Lotus Sutra teaching that everything is mind to directly challenge the Nirva Sutra restriction of awakening to sentient beings. The individual of the perfect teaching knows, from beginning to end, that the absolute principle is non-dual and that there are no objects apart from mind. Who then is sentient? What then is insentient? Within the assembly of the Lotus there are no differences. Scharf 2007, 214. While it is possible that the topic of the Buddha nature of the insentient had some intrinsic appeal for Zhanren and other Chinese thinkers, according to Scharf 2007, Zhanren was specifically inspired by the unorthodox positions taken when the topic became the center of fierce dialectical competition between the early Chan schools, and a twist on the earlier contention that insentient things cannot awaken. because they do not have minds and delusion. One Chan master drew on the idea of the Tao way, to argue that precisely because they lack mind and sentience, and thus have no thought of me or mine, grasses and trees are in accord with the way. Another suggested that insentient things can even cultivate realization and become Buddha's Sharf 2007, 217-218. However, the most influential statement on the matter was made by Nyanayang Huzhong, 675-775. A particular verse had become central in the debate. Lush groves of emerald bamboos are holy suckness, luxuriant clusters of chrysanthemums. Nothing is not gnosis. Commenting on this verse, Huzhong draws on the Hawaiian Avatasika Sutra to explain that the entire universe is the body of Vairocana Buddha. The Buddha body fills the Dharma realm and manifests itself before all beings. It responds in accord with conditions, extending everywhere, yet it remains ensconced on the seat of awakening. Sharf 2007, 221. He famously explains that as the body of Vairocana, the insentient continuously preach the Dharma, even if only those who are awakened can hear it. Sharf 2007, 224. Several decades later, the founders of Japanese Buddhist schools developed this idea. They were likely primed to receive the more radical Chinese notions of Buddha nature due, in part, to Shinto animist ideas, such as the idea that plants and humans share a common divine ancestry. Parks 1997. Or that grasses and trees existed and even spoke before the arrival of people. Grashadagusa, or humankind. Suki 2018. Seicho, 766-882. The founder of the Tendai school, seems to have been the first to refer to the Buddha nature of rocks and trees. But QK, 774-835, the founder of Shingon, a tantric school, was the first to elaborate on the idea of the Buddha nature of the phenomenal, and especially, natural world. Parks 1997, 114. Like Huzhong, QK draws on the idea of the world as the body of Vairocana Buddha, and refers specifically to the Buddha nature of plants and trees, explaining that this fact can only be seen by opening one's Buddha eye. Parks 1997. 114. He further explains that although Vairocana expounds the Dharma through his body, this is not necessarily for us humans, but rather for his own enjoyment. QK also describes the entire natural world as a sutra, being painted by brushes of mountains, by ink of oceans. Heaven and earth are the bindings of a sutra revealing the truth. Parks 1997, 116. Dajin, 1200-1253. The founder of the Sado Zen school, seems to have been influenced by QK as well as earlier Chan teachers. He famously reinterprets the Nirva Sutra statement that all sentient beings have Buddha nature as all is sentient being, all beings are Buddha nature. Parks 1997, 116-117. Echoing QK, Dajin also identifies the entire phenomenal universe with the sutras. When you endeavor and right practice, the voices and figures of streams, and the sounds and shapes of mountains, together with you, bounteously deliver 84,000 gathas, teaching verses. Just as you are unsparing in surrendering fame and wealth, and the body-mind, so are the brooks and mountains. Parks 1997, 117. What we mean by the sutras is the entire cosmos itself. The words and letters of beasts are those of hundreds of grasses and thousands of trees. The sutras are the entire universe, mountains and rivers and the great earth, plants and trees. They are the self and others, taking meals and wearing clothes, confusion and dignity. Parks 1997, 118. Like Huzhong and QK, Dajin also explains why we may fail to hear the Dharma expounded by insentient beings. The way insentient beings expound the true teachings should not be understood to be necessarily like the way sentient beings do. It is contrary to the Buddha way to usurp the voices of the living, and conjecture about those of the non-living in terms of them. Parks 1997, 117. Though the voices of the living and non-living are different, with each kind of being or entity expounding the teaching in its own way, Dajin sees this preaching as a collective endeavor of the Sangha of the whole great earth. Trees and grasses, wall and fence expound and exalt the Dharma for the sake of ordinary people, sages, and all living beings. Ordinary people, sages, and all living beings in turn preach and exalt the Dharma for the sake of trees, grasses, wall and fence. Waddell and Abe, 2002. Conclusion on the Dharma of plants. Though thought-provoking, I have to admit that I find these historical Buddhist perspectives on plants a little unsatisfying. The view that the entire natural world is continuously preaching the Dharma is inspiring, but I am uneasy with East Asian Buddhists' embrace of the later Indian Buddhist view that plants are insentient and not even alive. I also have trouble lumping plants together with tiles and other human artifacts, like the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. I'm inclined to agree with the Thai forest teachers, Ajahn Shah and Bud Hadassa, who were quoted at the beginning of this issue of Insight Journal, and claim that there are particularly deep lessons for us in the Dharma of the natural world. I think this may be true, even if the Dharma of plants is not specifically for us, as QK suggests. Dajin's teaching that beings and entities express the Dharma in their own distinctive ways also resonates strongly with the wonder I feel in the face of the extraordinary complexity and otherness of plants revealed by modern science, as well as in the energetic intimacy I sometimes feel when I commune with trees in particular. Not only each species, but each individual tree seems to embody a distinctive personality, an energetic pattern, or medicine that can have an unexpectedly profound effect on my body and mind. Is this the tree speaking? Is this the tree teaching what it means to cool down from the heat of our confusion, despair, anxiety, and suffering, as Bud Hadassa puts it? Or am I just projecting my own human-centeredness onto the tree? While Indian Buddhists regarded the saintliness of trees as mere metaphor, there are trees in whose presence I question this, who seem viscerally to embody equanimity, patience, generosity, and other dharmic virtues. I also wonder if some of our Buddhist forebears, however awakened in other respects, might have suffered from occasional plant blindness with their focus on human suffering and potential. I have more questions than answers, but that's probably how it should be, and the time seems ripe for a more intimate and experiential exploration of the Dharma of plants. I am grateful to the contributors to this volume for helping to initiate this. Works cited: Calvo, Paco. 2022. Planta Sapiens, The New Science of Plant Intelligence. New York, Little Brown. Findley, Ellison Banks. 2008. Plant Lives, Borderline Beings in Indian Traditions. New Delhi, India. Modelo Banarsides. Gagliano, Monica. 2018. Thus Spoke the Plant, a remarkable journey of groundbreaking scientific discoveries and personal encounters with plants. Berkeley, CA. North Atlantic Books. Myers, Karen. 2023. Intention in the Polycetus and Abhidharma. Oxford Research Encyclopedia of Religion. Access July 9, 2024. Narby, Jeremy and Raphael Chantry Pizzeri. 2021. Plant Teachers, Ayahuasca, Tobacco, and the Pursuit of Knowledge. Navada, CA. New World Library. Parks Graham. 1997. Voices of Mountains, Trees, and Rivers. QK Dojin and a Deeper Ecology. In Buddhism and Ecology. The Interconnection of Dharma and Deeds. Edited by Mary Evelyn Tucker and Duncan Ryken Williams. Cambridge, MA. Harvard University Press. 111-128. Schlanger, Zoe. 2024. The Light Eaters, How the Unseen World of Plant Intelligence Offers a New Understanding of Life on Earth. New York, HarperCollins. Schmidhausen, Lambert. 1991. The Problem of the Sentience of Plants in Earliest Buddhism. The International Institute for Buddhist Studies. Schmidhausen, Lambert. 2005. Meat Eating and Nature, Buddhist Perspectives. Supplement to the Bulletin of the Research Institute of Buckeye University. March, 183-201. Schmidhausen, Lambert. 2009. Plants in Early Buddhism and the Far Eastern Idea of the Buddha Nature of Grasses and Trees. Lumbini, Nepal. Lumbini International Research Institute. Scharf, Robert H. 2007. How to Think with Chan Gongan. Thinking with Cases, Specialist Knowledge in Chinese Cultural History. Edited by Charlotte Fort, Judith T. Zeitlin, and Ping-Chen Sheng. Honolulu, Hawaii. University of Hawaii Press. 205-243. Suki, Fumihiko. 2018. The Buddhahood of Plants and the Japanese View of Nature. Dharma World, July to December 3, 5. Waddell, Norman and Masao Abe. Trans. 2002. The Heart of Dajin Shabagenzo. Albany, SUNY Press. Interestingly, the example of a magnet is used elsewhere to illustrate how an intention, satana, is attracted to an object or goal. Myers, 2023. The lack of autonomous movement is the primary argument against plant sentience. Buddhists also explain their insentience based on differences from animals, e.g., the fact they lack bodily heat, and do not breathe, get tired, blink, answer when addressed, or pull away when injured, and can regenerate their limbs. Schmidhausen, 1991, 91-94. Interestingly, it seems plants can, In fact, be put to sleep or at least anesthetized. Calvo 2022. Introduction. 2. Shame plant. This plant is socially awkward. https://www. YouTube watch. V equals sec 0 by HMXW. 3. For an entertaining summary of the experiment, see, can plants remember? https://
Look at him. Look. Little fat nose ass boy. Bitch, move.
Anti-human.
Won't be reminded of the lost days. Used to rob the blood for all this work so I can maintain. Hey, won't be reminded of the lost days.